You know, the DCEU has had its ups and its downs, and when you get to some of those low points, getting through them kind of does take nerves of steel. What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to my channel, and the first part of a series I'm not doing in my usual style. With the release of the Snyder Cut of the Justice League on the horizon, I'm going to go through some of the DCEU films that I missed, and emphasis on some, as due to my schedule I couldn't start this sooner, so when covering these remaining DCEU films, I'm splitting this up. Leading into the Snyder Cut, I'll be covering Man of Steel, Batman vs Superman, Wonder Woman, and the theatrical cut of the Justice League. And leading up to the Suicide Squad later this year, I'll be covering 2016 Suicide Squad along with Aquaman and Shazam. Then afterwards, I'll rank all the DCEU films from the worst to the best. So, we're starting with Man of Steel. Before we begin, let me know in the comments what your thoughts on Man of Steel were if you've seen it already, and make sure to hit that thumbs up button if you like these reviews, as it helps me out immensely by getting my channel out there. And if you're new here, I hope you consider hitting that subscribe button so you can stay up to date with reviews of new releases, older films, hidden gems, and so much more on a near daily basis. But let's not waste any more time and let's talk about Man of Steel. This stars Henry Cavill as Kal-El, aka Clark Kent, aka Superman. As a young boy, he learns that he has extraordinary powers and is not of this earth. And as a young man, he journeys to discover where he came from and what he was sent here to do. But the hero in him must emerge if he's to save the world from annihilation and become the symbol of hope for all of mankind. Just as a forewarning, I am going to get into spoiler territory here. I tend to do these with my reviews of older films, not so much my reviews of newer releases, but there are some parts of the film I wanted to discuss that do go into spoiler territory. So that's your spoiler warning. If you haven't seen the film by now and you want to know nothing, watch the movie, then watch this. But anyway, here we go. This is directed by Zack Snyder, and this has always been something of an anomaly within the DCEU. Critics were definitely mixed on it, though it was difficult to get a finger on the pulse of what audiences really thought of it. It did seem to be more mixed as well, because I've heard everything from people calling it a hot mess to others saying they have a soft spot for it. And I remember liking it at the time, but I feel it generally gets lost in the mix due to the way in which the early days of the DCEU have been handled, as reception of most of those films up until Justice League have been less than favorable. I never fully wrapped my head around the criticism surrounding this at the time, and I never got a chance to sit down and watch it in its entirety again up until recently for this review. And while I can see where the criticism may stem from, I still actually found myself really liking this one, and I find it to be the most underrated DCEU entry. And now, I'm going to be quite honest. I am not a die-hard Zack Snyder fan. He's had movies I liked, but his two films directly before this one were The Legends of the Guardians and Sucker Punch, neither of which I particularly care for. And even then, among the films I liked, not all of them wowed me. So I do remember at the time being hesitant walking into this. But his direction here actually was pretty solid, I will say. And unlike his other films, this doesn't feel like a Zack Snyder movie. Like, at all. In fact, this feels very much like a Christopher Nolan movie. I'd probably call this the best Christopher Nolan movie that Nolan didn't actually make. Which I think is where some of that criticism stems from, because this was made right after the Dark Knight trilogy came to a close, and those were massively successful. And as I covered in my reviews of those films, which I'll leave a link to in case you want to check them out, the Dark Knight trilogy inspired tons of movies that go down this gritty route. A lot of big franchise movies were dark, somber, very serious, and a lot of them tried to replicate Nolan's style to a degree. And that's especially the case with this film, which makes sense considering Nolan himself produced it and conceived the story. David Goyer, who wrote the Dark Knight trilogy, also wrote the screenplay for this, and Hans Zimmer, who scored most of Nolan's films, also scored this, which, by the way, his score is one of the best parts of this movie. Though, if you knew nothing about this movie going into it, there's a chance you could be fooled into thinking this actually is a Christopher Nolan movie. And the issue is not so much that the film tries replicating Nolan's style per se, it's the fact that while Superman is a hero who you can take seriously, he's also not Batman. He's not someone who we constantly see brooding and down and out. I mean, he does have tragic elements of his backstory, and that's explored here, but Superman does represent hope and courage. Possibly along with Spider-Man, he's the epitome of an optimistic superhero. And that's not totally conveyed here. Not to say that Superman is brooding throughout all this, but this is Superman presented with a darker feel, and we do dive a little more into the tragic elements of his backstory, just a bit more than we would in any other Superman movie. Like, this is definitely darker than any of the Christopher Reeve movies, that's for sure.
Oh. Going down, please. Going down. Going down. Going up.
But the argument also can be made that he isn't totally Superman yet, as the film goes a little deeper into his time before being officially Superman. I mean, he's never called that name until the very end of the movie, and he does things that the Superman we know and love wouldn't do because he was still trying to find his path, and the film is about him trying to move past his more tragic elements. So, this does make sense. Can it be a little too dark sometimes? Sure. Yeah, I don't deny that. But unlike other films that tend to go for the Nolan style, I actually didn't find this film depressing for the most part. In fact, there's actually an endearing quality to it. And it's partially due to Henry Cavill's performance, and I will say, he's been one of the most consistently enjoyable elements of the DCEU's early days. Apparently he was criticized when this was first released as being stiff, but I never got that feel here. I actually found him to be quite enjoyable. I mean, could we have gotten maybe just a tad more of a personality from the character himself? You can argue that, but I found Cavill as someone who exudes such a natural likability to him that you do care about his journey. And what I think makes his story resonate a little more emotionally, despite his shortcomings, was the opening sequence on Krypton. Unlike the original Christopher Reeve film, this goes much more in depth to the events leading up to Krypton's destruction, with some very riveting sequences between Russell Crowe as Jor-El and Michael Shannon as Zod. I thought the design of Krypton looked fantastic. None of the digital effects looked hokey, plus the performances of both Crowe and Shannon were great in these moments. You can immediately feel both the tension and the stakes because they were both so captivating right from the beginning. And because they laid such a strong foundation and made it clear how serious the situation was right from the beginning, I think that helped us get invested easier into the story, as we know it's going to play a part later on. And whatever criticisms you have for Superman are, you can't say he's exactly whiny or depressing or anything like that. Troubled maybe, but he's someone who does want to see the hope in certain situations, even if he has trouble shaking off parts of his past. He's still meant to be a likable guy. And Michael Shannon as Zod is just a great villain, like probably one of the most well-written of all the DCEU villains, and probably the highlight of this entire movie for me. And what makes him work so well is what makes any great villain work well. In his mind, he initially thinks he's doing the right thing, which is in this case trying to rebuild Krypton. We obviously don't agree with what he's doing, but we at least understand what he set out to do, and it's not done in this one-note or cliched sort of way, so it makes him interesting. On top of the fact that Shannon is always at his best whenever he plays either a sneering, sarcastic anti-hero or a villain, and when he says something threatening here, he truly felt menacing, so we felt the gravity of the situation whenever he was on screen. Even when you just hear his voice, like when he broadcasts the signal demanding to know where Kal-El is, it can send chills up your spine. Kevin Costner was the other big standout for me in terms of the cast, and even though his scenes played into those more tragic elements I mentioned earlier, he also gives off a much needed sense of warmth whenever he was trying to give fatherly advice. And that's one of Costner's biggest strengths. He can be a protagonist in more action-oriented movies and do just fine, but whenever he gets to be this family man, that's when he really shines. So this role played perfectly to his strengths. And everyone else was pretty solid here. I thought Amy Adams was good as Lois. I think her performance definitely elevated the material, as her main shtick is just that she's trying to track Superman down and get his story out there. That's about it. Not much of the character otherwise, but Adams herself was great, as she always is. Diane Lane was also nice to see as Clark's mom, though she didn't get a ton to do herself, to be honest, and Lawrence Fishburne was also pretty good as Perry White. His scenes mainly just consist of him arguing with Amy Adams, but they were fine for what they were. As for the pacing, I actually didn't find this film to move slow by any means, which is shocking given that 2.5-hour runtime and its darker feel. But it moved pretty quickly, to be quite honest. Even during moments of downtime, because the interactions among all the cast members work so well, it's enough to keep you interested. At least it did for me. And as for the most controversial element, which is the ending where Metropolis gets torn apart along with Superman snapping Zod's neck in order to save a bunch of people, again, he really wasn't Superman up until this point. This isn't someone who has fully established this moral code, and he's still trying to figure himself out. If this is an origin story, it's actually good this shows the part that maybe people aren't so willing to see, which is our hero making what just aren't mistakes, but mistakes that will have dire consequences. And these mistakes will then affect their journey and cause them to strive to improve. Am I saying it's right Metropolis got destroyed? Of course not, but I think the logic here made sense. Especially since Zod is about to murder a bunch of innocent people. I mean, Some people really had an issue with the fact that Superman killed him, but in that moment, I didn't know what else he was expected to do. The only thing I'd say is that maybe the situation shouldn't have been written where it comes down to Zod about to kill people, because in that moment, there didn't seem to be any other option for Superman. And one last thing, I think another reason this deserves a little more credit than it ultimately got is due to the fact that unlike a lot of other superhero movies we get now, this is a rare standalone superhero movie in a time where things like world building were becoming huge. I mean, while it did kick off the DCEU, unlike the ending of Iron Man where there was the infamous post-credit scene with Nick Fury, this doesn't have that. In fact, this doesn't say or do much when it comes to paving the way for future movies, other than a few offhand references. Which, to be fair, it has been said this will lay the groundwork for future movies, but it wasn't explicitly written with the intent of a bigger cinematic universe in mind. There were no talks about this until like a few days before this movie's release. This was mainly written just to get a reboot of Superman off the ground, especially since audiences were mixed on the last Superman movie, Superman Returns. Like I said, I believe the intent of DC was to make more movies, but at the time, maybe not necessarily rely on them connecting to this larger picture. And while this wound up hurting DC for the next few years, which we'll get into in the next video, the fact that the focus was on nothing but just telling a good Superman movie benefited the film, because you can watch this on its own and still get a sense of emotional satisfaction. There are no cliffhangers, no storylines that had to wait until like 3 movies down the road to get properly resolved, and if they weren't to make another Superman movie in this universe, you'd still be okay with where they left this off. So, in a time where everything's trying to be the cinematic universe, which became huge right around this time, especially since The Avengers was just released a year prior, it is nice to appreciate a superhero movie that stands on its own. This is honestly a lot better than people give it credit for. I mean, I'm not saying it's the best Superman movie out there, but it still feels like an emotionally compelling story. Henry Cavill does a great job as Superman, and we have one of the best DCEU villains in General Zod. It's shot well, has an enthralling score, has well done action scenes, and made for a great way to kick off the DCEU. Man of Steel gets an 8 out of 10. So stay tuned. Next up is Batman vs. Superman: Dawn of Justice, which will be interesting. I'll leave that there. But in the meantime, let me know. Did you see Man of Steel? Or are you planning to see it? And what were your thoughts? Did you actually like this one? Do you have a favorite Superman movie? Let me know in the comments below so we can discuss. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it. And for more movie reviews and film discussion, please make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated. Thanks for watching, everyone, and keep having fun with film.